The format is changing this episode. Rather than more details on the Emos model, I'm actually having a conversation with someone else who's published a very similar model very recently. Dr. Budson, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself and your paper.
Sure. So I'm Andrew Budson, and I went to Haverford College as an undergraduate, which is this institution that you're seeing in my backdrop. Makes me feel very at home. I was a chemistry, philosophy double major there, interested in trying to understand consciousness at that time. And I thought, well, double majoring in chemistry and philosophy, that's what's going to be able to get at both ends of this question. And then I went to Harvard Medical School, and I knew I was going to be either a psychiatrist, neurologist, or neurosurgeon, somebody there to help get at the connection between the mind and the brain. Ended up doing a neurology residency at what was then the Harvard Longwood program, doesn't exist anymore. And then did a fellowship in cognitive behavioral neurology at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and then began to take care of people with memory disorders, dementia, strokes, and other disorders that can affect thinking, memory, and consciousness. And currently, I am the chief of cognitive and behavioral neurology at the Veterans Affairs Boston Healthcare System, so the VA in Boston. And I'm also the associate director of the Boston University Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And I co-direct a lab called the Center for Translational Cognitive Neuroscience, where we're working on all sorts of different problems, including trying to understand consciousness. And so the paper that came out recently, and is an open access, so any of you out there, you can just Google the paper's title, which is Consciousness as a Memory System, and put my name, Andrew Budson, Budson, and the paper will pop right up, and you can read it off the screen or download it, whatever you like.
Right. And I will also have a link in the show notes to the paper, as well as on our website. So, thanks for joining me and for the Subjective Experience podcast. And why don't we get into it? So before I ask you about what consciousness is, I want to ask you about what it seems to be. So, of course, this wouldn't be a bit of an overgeneralization because everybody's experience seems to be unique. But in general, what do our intuitions tell us about what consciousness is?
Well, I think this is a great way to start, because I really think that's the essence of the problem, which is how do we understand our own subjective experience? I certainly experience sights and sounds and smells, sometimes all at once, or sometimes really one at a time. And I can sort of hold on to these different ideas or thoughts or representations or feelings that I have from time to time. And you and I have already had a couple very interesting discussions about whether you would consider a self. Is that one thing that I feel? And I would say, I think I feel that. And you recently challenged me to say, well, what about a fictional character? Are they real? And I would argue that my representation of Harry Potter in my mind is as real to me as myself is in my mind. And both valid representations. Okay.
So the fictional character in its own way is real because there is, and I agree. I think that the self in a similar way is real. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, the thought of that character is real in as much as I have a thought that I'm going to be giving a talk 2 hours from now, and I can imagine that talk, and that's real. I can also think about the dinner that I had last night, and that's real. And all these things are real representations, real experiences that I've either had, am currently having, or am anticipating having in the future.
Right. Then about the intuition that you've written about, and I've written about, like different pieces of evidence which suggest that our intuitions about consciousness can't possibly be right. Let's frame out the kind of a Cartesian intuition of consciousness is about.
What does it seem to be from a naive point of view?
Sure.
Right?
The straw person that I typically use is the sort of common sense view of consciousness, which is, we all expect that we're conscious so we can make decisions, do things in the world, stuff like that. I can make a conscious decision that I'm not going to eat that chocolate cake. But, oh my God, I just ate the chocolate cake, even though I consciously decided I wasn't going to eat it. So this is like immediately the problem. Like we can consciously decide to do things, but they don't always happen. And the other thing is we can be, say, driving a car. And if you are engaged in a vigorous discussion with a friend of yours sitting in the passenger seat, you may not be consciously aware of what happened like the last 10 miles. You're like, how does that happen? Were you driving when you weren't conscious? There you go.
So it seems like the brain is doing lots of things, including driving the car, but they don't necessarily make it into consciousness.
Exactly. So I think we have an intuition that our consciousness is involved with like everything we're doing all the time. But what we argued in the paper, and I know you believe as well, is that in fact, most of these activities are really going on unconsciously.
Right. So let's go ahead and get into the things from your paper. Particularly, I'm looking for a couple pieces of evidence of time delay that you talk about and how that contradicts our intuitions.
Yeah. Part of it is that if we look at the amount of time it takes in order for a visual input to become conscious, in order for us to decide something and consciously execute a motor function, the amount of time it takes is way too long in order for a baseball player or a tennis player to watch that ball coming at them and swing at it. It's just too slow. It just doesn't make sense. It just can't really be under our conscious control. And it's actually interesting to me that like people have known this for like a long time, for at least probably close to 100 years, at least 50 years. And people just haven't been able to, I don't think, have a really good explanation as to why.
Right, absolutely. And we talk about the driving situation. Since there's a lag of a third to a half a second, if you try to drive with a third to half a second lag, you would be crashing into a lot of things. You need all that time to react.
Yeah. No, this is true. And I think the driving is also a good example that most of us have experienced at least one time in our life when we're driving, we're talking to a friend, I'll use the words, we weren't actively paying attention to the road. And all of a sudden we found like we stopped suddenly. And it was like you realized for a second that you stopped before you consciously understood why you stopped. And right. It's a very alarming experience. And you're just sort of like so grateful that you stopped in time, but you're sort of, there's that split second that you're actually confused, like what's happening, but you realize you stopped the car and prevented an accident.
Yes. I think about improv comedians who are saying a joke before they even know what the joke is. Like they're on it and somehow the joke follows. The people who learn to trust that intuition or whatever it is, that unconscious part, right?
Yes. And another example in terms of performers are musicians, particularly improvisational musicians, like you go to a jazz concert and, the musicians are just in the zone and they're just like riffing off each other, going back and forth so quickly, much faster than it could possibly be, consciously processed.
Right. So this time delay, then there's the brain and then there's consciousness. The brain seems to be doing the thing and then consciousness seems to be following a little bit afterwards. What is that relationship?
Yeah. So what we argued in the paper, saying that consciousness adds a memory system, is that consciousness is really part of this memory system that we have in our brain. The sort of technical scientific term is explicit memory. And explicit is really sort of a synonym for conscious. So it's sort of our conscious memory. Now, what's novel about the theory is it had been sort of assumed, well, there's consciousness and there's, of course, unconscious processes. And you can have memory for either the unconscious processes or you can have memory for the consciousness. So you can have memory for either one. But what's novel about our theory is we're saying it's not like there's consciousness and then you can have memory for it. We're saying the consciousness and the conscious memory are the same thing. They're not different. So what that means is that our ability to have a consciousness of sights, sounds, thoughts, smells, feelings is technically a memory. We're technically experiencing a memory of something that just happened. Now, it might have happened 350, 500 milliseconds ago, so it might have been, very, very recently, but it's not in real time. It has this little built-in lag.
Yeah, people normally think, when they think about memory, they're only thinking about memory that's already passed and that they're recalling at the time. But the brain is generating brand new memories all the time, right?
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you brought that up, because there are different kinds of memories that when I was trained as a memory researcher, and I know when you told me when you went to college, we were taught that these memories are sort of divided up into these different time frames. So there's like sensory memory that is for things coming in from our sensations. That's usually between half a second to 2 seconds. Then there's working memory, which is information that is actively kept in mind and manipulated. Like if you're trying to remember like a phone number in your head, or you're planning a route in your mind and you're sort of actively thinking about it, you'd be using your working memory. Then we have memory that's sort of for recent information, like remembering an event of our life, like what you had for dinner last night, or other things that you did, yesterday, last week, things like that. And then there can be semantic memory, that is your memory for facts and other types of information that are disconnected from a specific episode of your life. Like, I know what color a lion is, I know what a fork is used for, but I don't remember exactly like where I was and what I was doing when I learned that information. And so when I was trained, we used to spend a lot of time trying to fractionate these different types of memories. And you can separate them all out. That's not a problem. But what we argue in the paper, and we're not the first to argue this point, is that all these four memory systems, sensory, working, episodic, semantic, they really can be considered all part of one working, explicit or conscious memory system. And so when I talk about our consciousness is sort of a memory, I really mean it's any type of these memories, whether it's a sensory memory, working, episodic, et cetera.
Gotcha. Okay. The way that I frame it is specifically about episodic memory and the hippocampus, but that may be one of our few places where we have a slight difference in emphasis, you and I. The thing that stands out for me about the intuitive sense of what the relationship between memory and consciousness is that we would think that in the brain there would be a place where everything comes together for consciousness, and then there'd be a fat pipe going from that to memory, right? So it would be like hearing and vision and thoughts and emotions all come together for consciousness. And then there would be this pipe that goes back to memory, and then we'd be recording memories. But when you look in the brain, where everything comes together is at the hippocampus. That's where all the ventral and dorsal visual streams come together for the first time. That's where, the allocentric view comes in through the retrosplenial cortex, et cetera. These things all come together at the hippocampus and not before. And so that actually, it says that the creation of this memory happens before our awareness of it. So it's sort of flipped. Instead of us being aware and then having a memory formed afterwards, we're actually having a memory formed and then become aware of that memory.
Well, so right. So you and I may not see precisely eye to eye on this. And you brought up in one of your emails to me the problem of the patient HM, Henry Molaison. As I think probably most of your listeners know, he had first one and then the other of his hippocampus and other medial temporal lobe structures removed. And from the day when he had his second surgical procedure, he was never able to form a new episodic memory again, could not form a memory for an episode of his life, at least not anywhere close to like a normal episode that you or I create almost every minute. I would say he was still conscious.
Right.
But I would also strongly argue that his consciousness is impaired. And what we argued in the paper is that there are different aspects or types or forms. Steven Pinker likes to use the word modules. There's sort of different parts of consciousness, whatever adjective you want to apply to it. So I think you can talk about visual awareness or visual consciousness, talk about auditory awareness or auditory consciousness. And I think that each of these modalities of consciousness, they're represented in a different part of the cortex. And so I think that the visual cortex in the occipital lobe has the necessary architecture to form consciousness, conscious awareness of visual stimuli. That's theory, at least, that we espoused in the paper. And so that if one has a stroke in the occipital lobes or two strokes, one in each occipital lobe, which happens, these things happen. I've seen patients with bilateral strokes in the occipital lobes, and they can lose visual awareness completely, but they still have the other modalities of consciousness intact.
Yeah, so that's an interesting place to probe a slight difference in our emphasis, which is you're saying that consciousness actually exists in the cortex. Now, the way that I say it is that the hippocampus is like a player piano, which is playing an old memory, but the instrument is the cortex. So the cortex basically lights up according to the hippocampal signal, and that lighting up is the subjective experience. That is where subjective experience happens.
Well, you and I certainly agree there that I totally agree that the subjective experience is in the cortex. I think you're sort of on board with this, that it's not either the front or the back. There's a lot of people that say it has to be the frontal lobe. Then there's an equal number of people say it has to be the back of the brain, the parietal and occipital lobe. But they can't both be right. I sort of say, well, they're sort of both right. It can be either one. I really think it can be anywhere. That's what I argue. I mean, I think, well, how do you explain HM, I guess is the question, if you think it has to be the hippocampus?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question. HM, when you say he is conscious, that is kind of a loaded. That's part of the reason why I'm not a big fan of the word consciousness, because from a third person point of view, which is what the doctors would be talking about, his clinicians, they're talking about: is he responsive? Is he awake? Does he do things? Can you interact with him? Things like that, right? So that's basically what consciousness means from that outside. None of which is about subjective experience. If indeed the hippocampi are taken out, then it isn't a question of whether he's conscious or not, because that's, again, I throw that term out, but is a question of whether does he have subjective experience or not.
Yeah, this is why my 25 years taking care of patients with Alzheimer's disease, comes in handy. So people with Alzheimer's disease, even if they can form no memories and are as amnestic as HM, truly. So I see patients. I saw someone yesterday that was truly as amnestic as HM, and I look at their MRI scan, and their hippocampi are like little shrivels, and they have awareness. They have feelings. They can describe things. If it's just their hippocampus that's impaired, you really can find that. And the types of patients that are like that are young patients. So although most of my patients with Alzheimer's are in their 70s and 80s, I do have some, including the one I'm thinking of that I saw yesterday, who are in their 60s. I have some patients in their 50s. My youngest patient was 39. Wow. And an individual who was that old can have very focal damage to the hippocampus and essentially become like HM. So, what we argued in the paper is that there's a huge impairment in one's ability to function when the hippocampi are damaged. Yeah. Almost everyone, including HM, if you're not able to form new episodic memories, new memories for events and episodes of your life, you're not going to be able to live independently,
Right.
And so it's huge. You can't update your sense of self. It's a huge impairment. But I would argue, can that individual still have a subjective awareness, experience of a sunset, of a beautiful spring day, as being shown in my Zoom background here? I think you can have an experience like that and subjective awareness even without an intact hippocampus.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that, but I think the question is more on the question of what is awareness, because the baseball player, for example, he will tell you, I didn't see the ball coming, right? So in that way, he is not aware. But obviously, his brain is aware. Now, the person without a hippocampus, let's just take HM as our more extreme example, just because it's very clean cut, literally. The fact that he is interacting the parts of his cortex, what I call the immediate action network in the paper, movement, vision, all that stuff, sensory in, motor out, those parts are just fine. And they interact with the outside world just as the baseball player is interacting with the ball, right? So the baseball player has that level of awareness of the ball, but he doesn't have the other level of awareness, the level that happens within subjective experience. These are separate events. And so the amnesiac can be a person who lives within the first system entirely, right? So he's entirely living within the immediate action network, maybe with some participation of the default mode network, but no memory tying it together. There's tons of communication happening with the rest of the brain, so it's not like he shuts down, but he doesn't have the big picture, the big thing, which is the memory, that thing that it kind of informs, this is how I am going in the world. You can still enjoy things, but he can't enjoy the experience as a whole, perhaps, or the event as a whole, or something along those lines. That's what I would argue.
Well, I mean, I would argue that if you ate a chocolate sundae and HM ate a chocolate sundae, when he was living, he's deceased for those of you who don't know, that's why I use his name, that he could enjoy it as well as you could enjoy it.
Perhaps more.
See, I think that's the core essence of a conscious experience, a subjective experience, subjective awareness, is to be able to enjoy the taste of the chocolate, the texture of the fudge, the feeling of the little crystalline, vanilla ice cream on your tongue, and the coldness that's then warmed up by your mouth, and then it melts. That is a subjective experience. And so in that aspect, he's as conscious as anybody else.
Perhaps. So do you know the paper from Ellen McGuire's lab about boundary extension? For the people who don't know, Ellen McGuire has a lab in the UK which has a whole host of patients with their hippocampuses damaged, or some of them fully damaged. And so they have this kind of amazing insight into what's happening. And they drove a lot of the research that I depended on. I don't know about you. So this particular one, they had ordinary subjects, control subjects, and subjects with complete bilateral hippocampal damage, looking at an image and then looking at the same image a moment later and deciding whether the second image was larger, showed more space than the first image or not. And the funny thing is that the hippocampal damaged people were actually more accurate in their assessment because they realized that they were the exact same photographs each time, whereas the ordinary people, those control subjects, were not as accurate. My explanation for that is that they are looking at different things. I mean, one of them is having the control subject is having a hippocampal experience, and that one already has this boundary extension automatically. It's sort of a filling in, but it's kind of a filling in on the edges, which make the environment seem a little bit more larger around the object that they're looking at. Whereas the subjects without hippocampi are working from their immediate action visual thing and buffers within that, and they're able to hold on to those buffers. And those buffers actually hold on to the accurate image. It is only when that information goes from their neocortex buffers to the hippocampus that it turns into this other thing. And the control subjects seem to have this other thing, whereas the hippocampal damaged people, they're having different kinds of experiences, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. I didn't know that paper, but I don't think it negates what I was saying. I mean, I guess I think you don't need a hippocampus to have a subjective experience.
Right. So what I think that they're having what the baseball player's brain is having when it hits the ball. Now, the baseball player, because he has a hippocampus.
So, but what you're saying, but the baseball player says, I don't really remember the ball when it was coming at me. But do Eleanor McGuire's patients say, oh, I didn't remember seeing that image? I mean, I'm sure they don't say, I have no experience of that image.
No, but that I think is one of the things that's unique to people who are neurotypical, who have working hippocampi. All we have experience of is the hippocampal part, because the patients without hippocampi, they have access to this neocortical loops. But from within our experience, we don't have access to that.
So, Matt, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one. And maybe you can hang out. Don't forget, I've been working with these patients and their families for 25 years. You're not going to convince me that they don't have subjective experiences. They have subjective experiences.
Okay, I don't mean to throw away your experience. By the way, Ralph Peter Berendt was also he was a psychiatrist for Alzheimer patients, so he's coming from that same position, or he was. It's not that. I just mean that the distinction between those two might be very subtle and only internally visible. It is the kind of thing, like, again, talking about HM, everybody says he was clearly conscious, but they're talking about third-person views of consciousness.
No, I understand, but you're essentially saying that you think that HM and people with that degree of hippocampal damage are essentially philosophical zombies.
I think in some ways we all are, actually.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, by which I mean...
Well, Halloween was just a couple weeks ago, so I could have been one on that day for sure.
You agree with me that there are two different systems, right? That there is a system that is a fast and a slow one, right? And the slow one seems to be the one that works with the consciousness, right?
Yes.
What I'm just proposing is that your patients, presumably, but at least HM, was living in system one. And because the brain is plastic, it may be that he was able to use some feedback from the default mode network that caused something like experience. I don't know. But I don't see that there's necessarily that we have to say that HM had what we have. He can have something, that immediate action with the world, in the same way that, again, that if we're driving with a car and having a conversation with our friend, right, we only remember the conversation with our friend. The rest of it's still happening. The fact that we're not aware of it doesn't mean that our brain wasn't doing it. But it just means that we now have a memory of what was important to our brain at the time, which is the conversation. Our brains are fascinated by social interaction. And in the same way that this person maybe just is always in the system one, is always in the immediate action mode, because they can't put themselves in context of previous memories.
That's not the way that I would view it, because you see, I view that sensory memory and working memory can also enable the conscious experience.
So how do you disentangle those two?
In addition to having sensory memory and working memory, in addition to, episodic and semantic, people can absolutely do things unconsciously through routines, through habits, which is procedural memory that uses different parts of the brain. The cortex is usually involved. The cortex is involved in unconscious processing, but so is some deep structures in the brain called the basal ganglia and called the cerebellum. Those are very important for habits and procedures. And so when we are talking to a friend while we're driving and we're engrossed in conversation, our working memory, all of our memory resources, our attention, it's all being shunted to our friend. So it's that not only do we not sort of remember the road, but, I would sort of say in a conscious way, we're not really even sort of aware of the road, unless something sort of pops up and then gets presented to our consciousness. But
so who's the we in that way then? Because obviously my brain's aware of the road, right? Because it's steering, it's braking, it's turn signals, the whole thing. So where is the distinction between the part that's driving and the part that's aware? That's not aware of the driving.
Yeah. So I do think that there's a tension. I do think that it is required but not sufficient for consciousness to pay attention to something. So, there may be sensation inside my body or something outside of the window, And, those things could be happening, and some part of my brain may be aware of it, but unless I pay attention to it, I didn't use the right word. My brain may sense it. That's the word I meant to use. My brain may sense it. Okay, one of the sensors might have fired, but I won't be consciously aware of it unless I paid attention to that. And depending what the signal is, sometimes, it's something sort of externally. If like there was a big flash of light outside, that might draw my attention. I would then, maybe I'd move my eyes, or maybe my eyes would stay fixed on the screen, but I would still be aware of what's going on out the window. Or it could be that I am sort of choosing, like I am now, like I'm thinking about my fingers that are on the water bottle and the way it feels and how it feels a little bit cold. So I've sort of used my attention to be aware of a sensation that was there all along, or at least as long as I was holding my water bottle, but wasn't conscious until I paid attention to it.
Gotcha. So this very tricky relationship with awareness, attention, and consciousness. I mean, again, in mine, I toss out consciousness because I feel like memory is sufficient, but do you see that consciousness actually drives attention, or it actually, I mean, you just gave an example of like paying attention to this, but isn't it entirely possible that your unconscious brought in the information about your water bottle and then created this memory of the water bottle, and you reported that in a conscious way, but is there a need for consciousness in the middle of that?
Yeah. I mean, so as your listeners will find out if they read the paper, I use an analogy of a horse and a rider, where the horse is all of your unconscious brain processes, and the rider is your conscious mind that is sort of on top. And what is your conscious mind? Well, it's your ability to be able to use all of these memory systems, the sensory memory systems, to pay attention and be aware of things coming in through your senses, the episodic memory to recall prior events, the semantic memories to recall facts and other sorts of information, and then your working memory to take all of that information and manipulate it and do cool things like imagine the future or imagine two possible future outcomes, and then figure out, well, what is it going to take to be able to make this future outcome happen and not that future outcome? How can I make one happen and avoid the other one? But the bottom line is that just like a horse and rider, it's always your unconscious brain that's actually in control. So the horse is always deciding where you're going, and you don't need to tell the horse, how to walk across a rocky field or jump over a small fence, just like you don't need to tell your feet what to do when you're walking across the room. That's also unconscious brain processes. And in fact, if anyone studied mindfulness, it's sort of interesting to do mindful walking where you actually consciously think of like where you're going to place each foot as you walk. And so that's an example where your conscious mind, in my understanding, your rider can tell the horse what to do. Your conscious mind can tell your unconscious brain processes what to do. And the horse, your unconscious brain, may or may not comply. It doesn't have to. And it's just like to, return to an example I used at the beginning. It's like my conscious mind can say, I should not eat that chocolate cake, especially if it's like the third piece of chocolate cake. Like 2 pieces are really enough, they're really enough. And I will sit there and I will say, I shouldn't be eating this cake as I'm eating the cake, and it tastes so good. And I'm like, I shouldn't be eating this cake. And I even think that subjective experience of me as a self, a representation, just something, I have this feeling that I'm like sitting there watching myself do this, even though I don't want to. And actually, that was a little piece of intuition that helped me realize, maybe we don't really have direct control over our thoughts and actions, just like a rider doesn't really have control of the horse, right? It's up to the horse, what they want to do. But the rider's still important, because if you want to go from Carson City to San Francisco, that horse is very unlikely to get there on its own. It needs some conscious direction, and so that's why they're like a good team. They work well together.
So the self is more of a navigator? Is that what you're saying?
Well, in my view, the self is simply a word that I use for my subjective awareness. So if I can say that I can enjoy a bite of chocolate cake and I am tasting it, the I in there is my conscious self. But I'm well aware that there's sort of another part of me that's actually eating the cake,
Right. Well, let me ask you this. The baseball player who, again, the baseball is coming so fast that they don't see the ball. At least they report not seeing the ball, and yet most of the time they hit it, or half the time they hit it, or whatever. That person doesn't seem to have access. You said that you think consciousness includes not just the hippocampal memory, but also these working memory buffers or the sensory buffers and so on. But they don't seem to have any access to that. So why isn't that available to them?
What you're saying, the baseball player doesn't have access?
When they report, I swung before I saw the ball coming at me, right? So that's what the baseball player is reporting.
Because it happened too fast. But normally they can remember the ball afterwards. They can remember that they hit the ball, but just they knew they had to swing before they were, before they could consciously see whether it was, a fastball down the middle or a curveball that's going to go down out of the strike zone.
Right.
They had to make up their mind and swing. And afterwards, they usually have conscious awareness that, it was too low. I shouldn't have swung at it. But they didn't have that access in the moment.
There's two different time scales, right? There's this immediate action thing, which happens on, like 100 milliseconds or even less sometimes, but just really short time scales. And then there's memory or this consciousness perception, which is more like a third to half a second, depending upon the input. So it would seem if we had access to both, that there would be an echo. Like everything would be constantly in an echo of the experience that's happening at the cortical level, at the sensory buffer level. And then there's also the hippocampal thing. And yet we don't have anything. We have one, unified experience that always seems to come late. So how do you include that sensory buffer, which doesn't seem to exist in our experience at all, as part of what quote unquote consciousness?
Well, I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking, but I can tell you that there's some interesting research right now that is examining, we have this episodic memory that recalls episodes of our life. How is an episode defined? What's the smallest instance that's considered like an episode? And it can be thought about in different time frames. If I think about on Friday night, I went out with my wife, and I could think about sort of the whole outing where we did some shopping in addition to go out for dinner as an episode. I can also think about just our dinner as an episode. I can even think about a separate episode of sort of the time that we order as an episode. So you can have different sort of set points as like what would be considered an episode, and you can recall each one individually. I mean, what I would say is that the timescales that we're talking about, I think are really going on. It's sort of the working memory that's really sort of making all this happen.
Right. I have the episode of our family visit to Ireland. That's over a week long, but there is a sense of it being kind of a unified thing. And then within it, there's many mini episodes. And I guess I would see that as more like the way that our brain tells stories about what happened. Mm-hmm. So it tries to take this series of things and connect them into an episode. And that, in terms of reporting our memories, it's really, I think, about just the way the brain tries to put stories together.
Yeah. And I would think, I know you're a big fan of the default mode network, and that's more or less working memory. That's the part of the brain that's doing most of the thinking. Would you agree with that?
The way I would say it is that it witnesses the new memory, and that it extrapolates, uses that input as it's basically its sole input, and says, okay, this this is what just happened. Now, how do I extrapolate beyond it? Whether connected to an old memory or imagine the moment that's going to happen next or what's going on in somebody else's head. Those are all behaviors of the default mode network responding to the memory as it comes in. Or if I'm ruminating about an old memory, then it's responding to the way that plays out. But it's intimately related with the episodic memory system, specifically in terms of like looking back at memories and trying to figure out what's meaningful within memories and so on. That's the way I would say it. I wouldn't say that as being working memory because I would think that usually working memory is defined as, something that's involved with a task. And most of the tasks that we're at least in scanning experiments, most of the tasks are cortical, right? That's why it took us so long to find the quote unquote default mode network, is because it was just kind of ignored because it would light up every time they stopped doing a task. So I kind of would look at it's the rumination, it's the figure out what's going on, the I'm bored, let's daydream. It's all those things. But basically, if there was anything Cartesian theater-like, it would be the default mode network basically witnessing the new memory is how I would define it.
Yeah, I have to think more about it.
Okay, no problem. So I know you only have a couple minutes left to talk about your model.
Well, I'll just mention a couple, I think, of the implications, right? So if one thinks about the fact that, first of all, we don't perceive the world directly, we perceive the world as a memory, it can be very helpful when you and a friend or a family member, you might witness, quote unquote, the same thing, but you'll come away with two different impressions as to what actually happened. And if you understand that our conscious awareness is not actually directly of sensation, it's not directly of the outside world, but in fact, it's a sort of a mashup, a combination between our bottom-up sensory processes and our top-down episodic and semantic memory processes sort of making this mashup. Then what it tells us is that two people can witness the same event and actually perceive and be consciously aware of two different things. So that's what it tells us. So that's one important implication.
Could that be rephrased as you create your own reality? I mean, that your brain is creating your own reality moment by moment, and that the person next to you is necessarily going to have a different reality than you have.
Exactly. So even if we sort of stipulated that their sensory apparatus of their eyes and ears was exactly the same as yours, and you were in the same vantage point, right, but you're still going to have a different reality. Absolutely. Yeah. And then if we use this horse and rider analogy to understand that when we are sort of making decisions and making actions, 95% of the time, it's this fast, unconscious horse decisions that are happening. And then we become aware of those decisions on the order of 350 to 500 milliseconds later. We're sort of aware that it happened. And even when we are using our conscious mind, it's really our unconscious brain, it's our horse that's actually using the conscious mind to do things. And that's why I say, well, in addition to this rider here, the other trick is that all these images that the rider can use, sensory memory, working memory, episodic memory, semantic memory, those images are all coming from the horse. It's the horse that decides what the conscious mind is seeing. Right. And it's the horse that decides what is important for the conscious mind to be looking at. And that's the reason that mindfulness is hard, that it's hard to actually focus your attention on something that you want, such as your breathing. If that's your goal for your mindfulness session, it's very hard. I've been practicing mindfulness for, over 15 years. And geez, I did it this morning. I do 12 minutes a day. It's still challenging. It's still challenging. And I think it's number one, it's one of the things that helps us all to intuitively know that we're not in control of our thoughts. We're not even in control of our thoughts. But I do think in terms of all your listeners out there, if you want to do a better job in being able to have some conscious control over your body, over your unconscious brain processes, I think one good way to start is to start by practicing mindfulness, so you begin to at least get a handle on, what your unconscious brain is sending you. You'll be able to control that a little bit better. And that can help you to pay attention more to the things that you want and ignore distractions better. For people who have trouble with thoughts that they don't want to be thinking about are running through their mind when they're trying to fall asleep or go back to sleep, it can be helpful for that. The other implication of the way I think about all this is that if you want to teach someone anything important, I would argue that you need to use teaching techniques that are going to be informative and appropriate for both your conscious mind and your unconscious brain. And what I mean by that is, for a lot of things, you can't just explain it to somebody in words or have them read a book. This is obvious in some ways. Like, if I was going to teach you how to drive a car, you can't learn how to drive a car just by reading a book. Okay. Right. You have to actually do some of the actions, or to play basketball or shoot a free throw or something. You can't learn it from a book. You have to actually work on doing it. But because so much of our decisions and actions are occurring unconsciously and are not part of our conscious mind, even to learn how to do mathematics or something like that, it's not enough to simply learn the theories and the ideas. You have to get your unconscious brain to be doing it through lots of practice. And again, maybe that one's obvious, but I really think it's applicable to almost everything we learn. You have to learn by doing, in addition to learning with thinking.
If you have 2 seconds more, then can you apply it to the chocolate cake?
Yes.
So if I'm going to be mindful about the chocolate cake, how do I make that happen?
So the first thing I would say is to just simply be aware of the fact that, it's not really me, Andrew Budson, as a conscious entity, as the rider that wants to eat this. It's really my unconscious brain processes that are saying, this is pleasurable, give me more, give me more. And so sometimes, actually, believe it or not, just being aware that I'm being manipulated by my unconscious brain, that's enough to say, all right, I'm not going to play this game anymore. I know what's going on now. Now I figured it out. I'm essentially being manipulated. I'm going to stop it right here, right now. And I think that's how people who decide to stop smoking, that's how they quit. They just sort of say, enough is enough. I'm done with this. So that's one way. And then the other way is use your conscious mind to do what it's good at doing, which is being smart and setting up strategies and techniques. So don't leave the whole chocolate cake on the counter. Take one piece, whatever amount you want, and put it upstairs, or wrap it up, or put it in a safe, or give it away, do something like that. So, you have to basically take advantage of the time when your unconscious brain isn't calling the shots to be able to do the right thing. So, for example, it's like, if you only want to eat one piece of chocolate cake, will you go to the bakery of your supermarket and say, I'd like one piece of chocolate cake, rather than buying the whole cake? What I tend to do, I like to eat. I don't mind saying it, but I work on buying healthy food. So I wait till I'm in a good state and I go to the supermarket and I buy healthy food. So if I'm hungry, I eat, but it's a lot of healthy food. So that's my own technique.
Nice. So I know that you have to go. I just want to remind everybody that this is Dr. Andrew Budson, and his paper, Consciousness as a Memory System, is published in the journal Cognitive and Behavioral Neurology. And thank you very much for your time, Andrew. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.